There's something evil in the forests of Illinois. They look like trees. Part 1. Written by YungSeti and narrated by ladyspookariayt. My plan for that day had been simple, relaxing even. It was my first outing since the lockdown had eased, and I was nearly bursting at the seams to get out of my small apartment and back into the world. I planned to take my regular weekend trip through one of the state's many parks, clearing my mind of the baggage accumulated over a week of working remotely for my phone bank, a job I hated but kept out of absolute necessity. That day now lives on in personal infamy as the day in which the trajectory of my life was changed, by the veil being lifted from over my eyes, being exposed to the true horrors that call our world their stomping grounds. It was Saturday, one of the 2 days allotted by the work week for me to actually try and enjoy my life. The goal was to go for my usual hike, taking the 2.5-hour drive from my cramped Chicago apartment out to my favorite of one of the state's lesser-known state parks, and disappear down my favorite of its all but unused hiking trails, as was customary, taking photos of whatever interesting wildlife or flora I saw along the way. My weekend escapades into some of the various forests of my state were always about escapism. They were the few moments I could steal for myself, in which I could escape the grey fog of blandness that seemed so pervasive in my life since college days, worsened by the ever-suffocating realization that I was working a dead-end job, in a field I hated, in a city I didn't love, in a life of pure stagnation that I was growing more and more dissatisfied of by camping or hiking, giving me a feeling of purpose my life seemed to lack. My chosen trail was the most daunting of them all, a hike stretching several miles through some of the more uneven parts of the terrain, leading across a small bridge over a creek, through some rather dense forest on rather uneven ground. Due to the difficulty of its navigability, it was almost empty, save for the odd occasional hiker as dedicated as myself or park ranger, roaming the what little of a path existed amongst the ever-encroaching plant life, and even those were rare sights. When I'd arrived that day, however, I was greeted at the opening of the path by a red tape. Crossing over it, stretched between the handrails on either side of the small wooden entrance to the trail, a small sign hung from the center of it, its red letters immediately catching my eye.
Trail closed due to wildlife damages. Thank you for your patience. Park Service.
For a moment, I considered the warning. A quick glance around me revealed only a few straggling hikers, none of whom were paying me any mind, and no sign of any park rangers. I've gone off the path before. I could wade through that creek, no problem, I thought, a tingle of excitement buzzing through me at the prospect of a hike with the added element of stealth. I've always been something of a thrill seeker, an aspect of my life I rarely got to indulge in, stuck in a cubicle most hours of my life, and I couldn't pass up the chance to do something that got my heart racing, even as small as this. A grin stretched across my face, and I quickly made my way under the tape and down the path before anyone could take notice. The path was almost unchanged from usual, with the exception of an hour in as I approached the familiar clearing. A small man-made field of nothing, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by the oaks and pines. In it stood a massive white tower-like cabin on stilts, the fire lookout station. The path stretched directly through the clearing, and in view of any potential ranger on the lookout, who would surely turn me back. I crouched low, holding the straps of my camera bag close to my body to prevent it from shuffling against the leaves. Venturing off the path for the first time, staying well within the tree line. As I slowly made my way around the clearing, through the trees, I could sort of make out the ranger in the tower above, and her attention seemed to be directed the other way. I felt a small surge of relief at that. My hair stood on end in the excruciating silence. I doubt I even took a lungful of air until I was long past the clearing and back on the main path. Still, I kept my guard up. Based on what the notice had said, There'd been a fire in this area recently, and I could imagine there may be an increase of rangers on foot in the area to identify a cause. It was strange to me, though, that I'd heard nothing at all about such an event given how much I frequented the park, and I gathered it must have been recent. I reached the bridge soon after, or its remnants anyways, just a few acres past the tower, bearing the first visual evidence of any forest fire I'd seen since I'd entered. Charred remnants of the planks that had once been a bridge extended out from the earth in jagged pieces from both sides of the creek's bank. A few heavier chunks, in no better shape, caught on stones in the rushing water below. The fire had clearly ravaged the thing, leaving little trace of it, and I could understand why this could be seen as a potential hazard. A sudden inkling of curiosity raised the question as I looked at the area around the former bridge. None of the nearby trees seemed to bear any signs of a fire. No charring or missing leaves. Nothing. I wondered what kind of wildfire this was, and how it seemingly leapt past half of them directly to the bridge. Wind, perhaps? A traveling spark? The explanations felt wanting, but the thought was vaguely curiosity in itself, and not nearly enough to stop my hike. If anything, it was starting to feel like something of an adventure, which is exactly what I'd sort of wanted from these things. My smile returned as I began removing my boots and hiking socks, rolling up my pant legs as I stepped into the creek below. The water was colder than I'd anticipated, sending an icy jolt through me as soon as I made contact. It reached just above my knees, and the current was stronger than I'd expected, nearly making me lose balance and almost plunge my bag into the water. A sigh of relief escaped my lips as I maintained my footing, just barely, and crossed the stream with care, easing over the slick rocks beneath my feet. I put everything back on and continued the hike, at some point removing my camera from the bag and snapping pictures of the places where the afternoon sun broke through the canopy. I'd been walking for a little over an hour when I caught sight of what I realized was the first animal I'd seen since I'd arrived. A deer, a buck specifically, with a crown of white horns that stretched magnificently. I could almost see the shot lined up in my head. I fumbled with the strap of the bag, bringing it around to my chest as I took out my camera and lined up the shot, peering into the viewfinder.
Darkness.
The fucking lens cap, you idiot. I scoffed before I could realize it. The animal and I both looked at each other in that instant. Please don't. It was off before I could even finish the thought, darting deeper into the brush, down a decline of the uneven earth. I followed as best as I could, walking an impossible tightrope between staying close enough to keep it in sight and staying somewhat quiet, often failing at both. It settled down several yards ahead for a moment, taking a moment to sniff the air before disappearing down a steep decline in the hilly surface, behind a mass of bushes, salted with an odd dust. I took a moment to catch my breath, placing my hands on my knees to keep myself up as I huffed the deep breaths. Standing still for the first time since I'd gotten past the remnants of the bridge, I could see the signs of fire that had crossed the path. The ground was laid in a thin film of grey ash, like light snowfall, that covered everything in a light dusting. Beneath it, the forest floor was covered in leaves, all burnt to various degrees, some an unrecognizable black crisp, others just singed at the edges, all crumbling with contact. And there was something else. I squinted, confusion and a disgust interest blooming in the synapses of my brain as I noticed it. A wet, shiny film covered parts of the ground, ash and burnt leaves sticking to it. I'd almost missed it, the strange layer of whatever it was blending in with the charred leaves, black ash making its color murky. Its consistency was snot-like, and I shuddered, the mental comparison making me itch with repulsion, yet piquing an almost childlike sort of curiosity. Scanning the ground for a twig, I noticed several more piles of the stuff, the few spots of the goo not yet dried by the surrounding ash being blown across the floor by each passing breeze were almost opaque. with the slightest red tint. A sudden yell, animalistic and pained, rang out from the brush ahead, making my stomach drop as though I were on a roller coaster. My heart seized with an immediate grip of panic, shock rippling through me in uncomfortable waves. As the final echoes of the cry rang out, a suffocating silence fell. The air grew thick with a fog of unease, that spine-tingling cry ringing in my ears. I'd been hunting once, and only once as a kid. My father had shot a deer, but it was moving so he hadn't landed a killing blow. The bullet dug into its hind leg, and it fell and snapped the thing. That poor fucking animal, I swear it screamed. Not just bray like I'd heard animals do when they're upset or scared, but screamed the type of scream of something in true agony. Dad had quickly put it out of its misery, but that scream, I never forgot it. And this was too similar to that. Strands of creeping dread started to drape themselves over me, like a tattered cloak, as the sound brought me back to that moment. Another cry stirred me from memory, my thoughts coming somewhat frantically. The notice had warned of downed trees, and other hazards, and perhaps the animal had fallen victim to one of the above. My mind conjured an image of the beautiful thing, its leg partially impaled on some jutting piece of broken wood, as it screamed desperately for help that wouldn't come. Perhaps my thinking was clouded by an old trauma, logic failing me at the moment, but I felt an unshakable urge to help the creature. How would I be able to help a 200-plus-pound animal deep on a closed trail I wasn't meant to be on? I hadn't determined, but emotion drove my actions. I ran my mind across the smallest of predators one might encounter in an Illinois forest. Although none seemed likely, I wasn't going to take a chance. I rifled through the camera bag for a few tense moments, until I found what I was looking for. In the neighboring pocket to the one holding my emergency flare gun, with 2 flares tucked alongside it, was a cheap revolver. I bought it a few years before after a scary run-in with a mountain lion at another park, and I carried it for the sole purpose of scaring off something big. I felt a modicum of comfort as I gripped the handle. Adjusting my pants, I stuck it firmly between my waistband, confident that in the off chance of a ranger or anyone else was this far out to quell any fears of concealed carry violations. I tried to swallow the lump of anxiety in my throat, steeling myself as I slid down the slight decline, where the animal had disappeared through the tree line of some of the massive old oaks. So this is where it started. As I stepped through, it was as though I'd stepped into another world, entering a clearing that bore every potential scar of a wildfire. It was one of ash and waste, the ground littered with the few burnt stumps of the trees that had once stood. Sooty ash travelling along the breeze, sticking to the sweat of my brow. Save for the few staying twists of bark, charred a pale white, and the skeletal shapes of trees barren of their leaves and branches, the last stubborn remnants of the regal oaks that had once stood there. It appeared all but desolate until I saw it. At the dead center of this surreal little wasteland hidden within the trees, stood the only tree that seemed relatively unharmed somehow by the destruction that had been wrought. Something vague and ominous tingled in me at the sight of it. Dwarfed by the overwhelming curiosity, the unusual thing arose. It stood, all but untouched by the blaze that had laid waste to the forest around it. From where I stood, it looked like an almost unusually large birch tree. Its bark, pale with what looked like dark knots along its surface, a shock of brilliant red leaves extending from the top of it. As I drew closer, my eyes roaming its shape, I saw, peeking from the bottom of its trunk, 2 hooved back legs. The embers of unease were fanned, blazing a bit hotter, as I realized I'd found what I'd been looking for. The deer. That regal thing I'd intended to capture in all its glory. It was almost surely dead if not asleep, and I very much doubted it by its stillness, laying with its upper half concealed behind the wide trunk of the odd tree, and the way its legs splayed out unnaturally. I considered turning back, the thought weighing heavy on my mind with the growing unease. When else am I going to see something like this? This is why you come here, to be out of your comfort zone. The thought was almost a realization. but I knew it was true. There was no way I was turning back yet. Curiosity burned every bit as bright as my discomfort, perhaps brighter as I grew nearer, and saw the odd shuffle of the strange tree leaves. The scene was almost beautiful in a morbid way. The deer laying partially concealed behind the soot-laid white tree in a land of waste, as ash carried on the breeze like snow. The tree itself, I realized, was just as haunting in its own regard, and against my better judgment, I approached. Alone it stood at the center of the clearing, burned into the forest like a scar. Amongst nothing but ash and gnarled remains of others it stood. The longer I looked at it, the more I could feel an animal dread clawing at the recesses of my mind, which I dismissed as a natural instinct to being in an area following such ruin. As I approached, any semblance of beauty faded as it was brought into resolve. I'm no arborist, or whatever, and I'll never claim to be some expert in plants, but I'd seen my fair share of trees, and could identify near any native to the area. The thing was different. It looked vaguely like an oak, now that I was within a yard or two of it, yet its bark seemed strange, almost dead somehow. It bloated out, as though whatever grew inside couldn't fit the bark for much longer, distending outwards at unusual angles. Its color was more grey than the usual tone of brown, and little flecks of burnt wood flaked and peeled off all over it, leaving something resembling a ring of ash at its base. The knots bulging at it from points were all spherical in shape, with deep gouges down the center of them. It made my skin crawl with insectoid sensation. The urge to saw each of them off, raising the hair on my back until I got closer to look at the top of the thing. Jesus Christ, as I took a closer look at the tree's strange foliage. The leaves, if I could call them that, were unlike any I'd ever seen. They were less leaves by any recognizable metric, and more like clear sacs of reddish liquid, each in a teardrop shape that, at a distance, made them appear to be red leaves. As I drew closer, I couldn't tell what they were. They pulsated. Barely. But it was noticeable the longer I looked. They filled and emptied with each quiver, cycling more of that liquid through with each pump. It was like thousands of little malformed hearts lined the branches of the thing, pumping in unison. My skin crawled and contracted with primal disgust, as though insects were crawling the surface. Everything about the unnatural sight making me sick. I need to get a picture, I thought. The deal almost gone from my mind at this point. There was something so strange, so alien, and impossible about what I was seeing, that before I realized what I was doing, I'd slung my camera over my shoulder and reached out, the tip of my index finger touching one of the pulsating leaves. The pace of its pulse quickened to a frantic point. The red ooze contained within its membranous walls, leaking through unseen pores and onto my hand. Ah, fucking gross, I cried, yanking my hand away. A sickly sweet scent wafted forth me, as though the contact had caused it. An unappealing sensation when blended with the sheer disgust I felt at the substance. My stomach turned with the palpable threat of vomit in response. It was warm and thick, like coagulated blood, and it started to burn increasingly the longer it sat. I wiped my hand against my pant leg vigorously, managed to get most of the red liquid off, though it left a stain on my palm. My mind drew a blank for anything even vaguely similar, and from murky depths of my consciousness, something cried for me to get as far away as I could from the thing, an inexplicable dread rising me at the sight of the thing. Yet even more pronounced was the curiosity I felt surging, and the enticement of the prospect that I'd somehow discovered something unheard of, outweighing the surreality of the situation. This tree was utterly unlike any plant I'd ever seen, seemingly to possess features I'd only known to exist in animals, and my mind began to run wild with images of my name in journals and massive paydays for the first photographic evidence of an unknown form of life, and leaving behind the cubic life. As if by the flip of a switch as I stood there, I recalled the very reason I'd entered the clearing. The deer. I'd wanted to get a good look at it, a morbid curiosity as to why it seemed to drop dead, pushing me forth. I rounded the tree, the legs becoming more and more into view from around the other side as I did. The bark seemed to radiate an odd heat from somewhere within, reminiscent of the warmth emitted from another person's body when you stand too close. Nausea twisted my stomach into knots and my mouth went dry. The soles of my brown hiking boots were stained in a dark red amongst the clinging dirt. A swell of panic began to arise, my mind beginning to reel off possibility after possibility for why or how it could have ended up like that in so little time. Knowing no animal that was native to this part of the country was possible for that sort of destruction. I rounded the tree, feeling confusion and dread, both blooming in me as I realized I'd been wrong. Or half wrong, at least. The deer hadn't been laying there behind the tree. Not all of it, at least. It was certainly dead. Though what lay before me in a dark pool of scarlet blood was only the lower half of its body. Anything above the center of its chest torn away. As my head ducked, doing what I could to avoid my head touching one of those sticky leaves as I stared at it. Curiosity and the strange surreality of the situation freezing me in place. My mind beginning to flood with questions. Chief among them being, where was the second half of the creature? My mind reeled for an answer. I'd seen it a mere minutes ago, and to my understanding, even a mountain lion couldn't do so much damage in so little time, let alone disappear without a trace. I was beginning to question why I'd ventured this far. The light-hearted hopes of an adventure from earlier all but gone with the realization that I may have knowingly brought myself near whatever predator was capable of this. The stark silence in the clearing began to feel dark and foreboding, when the thoughts were scattered in an instant by the feeling of something warm and wet hitting the center of my forehead. A shock rippled out from the point of contact. I stumbled back, swiping away at it. Disgust blossomed out in waves, my stomach twisting at the sight of the red streak and along my hand. For a moment, I brought my hand close to my face reluctantly, expecting, almost hoping for the sweet scent of that strange sap from the leaves. I pulled back immediately once I knew there was none. It was blood. The consistency was unmistakable. I rubbed away vigorously at my forehead with the bottom of my shirt, staining it in the same color, my eyes roaming up the tree in an automatic response. The blur of motion from something large and dark falling quickly from above, along with the wet rustle of those strange leaves, spurred me into motion before I could process it. "Fuck!" I cried, leaping back in time to narrowly avoid being crushed beneath it. The impact of whatever it was kicked up a cloud of ash up in its wake, billowing in all directions, and I could feel an irritating itch in my throat as I breathed it in, descending into a brief coughing fit. As the ash cleared from the air, it revealed what had almost crushed me. Falling apparently somewhere out of the canopy of this unnerving tree was revealed. The air felt cold, colder than before, and a sense of horror bred only by a series of inexplicable events gripped my heart in an icy vice of panic as I looked up at the other half of the deer, my mind still reeling at its sudden appearance. Large puncture wounds lined its body as though something massive had been chewing on it. Tattered flecks of muscle and tissue hanging from the point at which it had clearly been ripped in half. My mind reeled, conjuring frightful images of the animal capable of doing this. It was time to go, I realized. There was something large and predatory nearby, and I didn't want to meet it. I turned to leave, giving a parting look at that impossible tree, its pale, strange bark, and those pulsating cell-like leaves. As I climbed the small incline out of the ashen clearing, I'd begun to walk back, but with every step, the nagging instinct to return, just for a moment, grew. It was as if my camera burned hot in my hand, begging me to go back and take just one photo of that thing. I forgot the picture. I came all this way for nothing at this point, I thought. And you'll never see anything like this again, probably. Just one picture. My pace slowed, and eventually, with a sigh, I came to a stop. "Goddamn idiot," I muttered. "Just one picture, from a distance, and then I'm out." I repeated it under my breath as if it were a mantra. My eyes on my camera as I proceeded back towards the edge of the area, scarred by the apparent fire, getting my settings in order. I arrived at the precipice of the little drop-in, and giving my camera a final once-over to ensure the process was quick and smooth, slid down into the clearing. I landed with a firm crunch of dead or dying leaves under my feet, and, closing my other eye, lined up the eerie tree in my viewfinder. Through the haunting shapes making up the forest charred remnants surrounding it, seeing it for the first time since I turned back. Crunch. An animalistic crunch rang out. My heart went into freefall. The clearing echoed with a stomach-churning series of sounds like sloppy chewing of a massive animal, making my blood run cold. Dread washed over me like a waterfall as I saw through my camera something I couldn't understand. Somehow, both half of the deer hung several feet from the ground, tangled in the pale limbs of the tree, which seemed to have wrapped one or more of its legs in a vice grip, as if it had grown around them. At first, it appeared that the tree was covered in insects, or small worms lashing out at the corpse, until I realized what I was seeing, and it was somehow worse. The feeling quickly faded into a sense of stomach-twisting horror, the likes of which I had never known before, and the utter alien impossibility of what I was looking at. Those leaves. I don't know if I can even call them that. They were like parasites. Small, rope-like growths shooting in and out of them, latching onto the animal's remains, going from pale to red as they filled with its blood. I watched, awash in a paralyzing blend of awed horror and disgust, as they thrashed at and fought with one another in their attempts to feed. Extensions colliding blindly into the corpse. They would sometimes entangle each other by accident in the frenzy, leading to a thrashing conflict, ending only when one seemed to tear the other from its leaf, which would grow another and continue the horrific feeding. It was frantic, unearthly, and I could feel my sanity shift under the weight of it all. Suddenly, as though receiving some collective instruction, the leaves curled away, withdrawing their strangled growths. In that same instant, the branch of the tree began to coil and tighten, resembling less the appendage of any sort of tree, and more the torso of a snake or some ungodly tentacle. The branch of the tree raised, with a slow creak that filled the air, and its bark tilted back, those reaching leaves lowered close to the ground. That hole, which I had rightfully assumed the deer had been impaled in, though I'd not anticipated how, opened wider, and I understood immediately what it was, as it squeezed remnants of blood and viscera from the poor beast's lower half. Like a child would a juice box, it lowered the rest of the animal into its mouth, gnashing violently on the bony lower half. The crunching continued, the sound horrid and muffled from within the bark of whatever this thing was, and its branch-like limbs lowered to its sides, the bark rippling and folding with motion. Like the hide of a lizard, it devoured its mouthful. Fear sent a spasm through my body. I tensed, my finger twitched. Beep, click. My camera gives off its electronic chime, followed by the click of the lens as it takes a photo. Searing panic grips my heart in a vice until it feels as though I may pass out. Everything in me yearned to run, to get as far away as from whatever impossibility I was seeing. My thoughts sporadic and non-linear in the sheer amount of panic I felt. But for a few moments, my body remained frozen, terror robbing me of my faculties. For several seconds, there was nothing. The noisy chewing from the thing in the center of the clearing stopped abruptly, but the whisper of the breeze among the surrounding leaves and the echoing click of the camera. The tension in the air was suffocating, and I stepped back against the mound of earth on my back, malevolent energy palpable in waves from the monstrous thing standing just yards ahead of me. I watched through the lens, afraid to even move my hand from my face. Every second of stillness watered both hope and swelling horror in opposition. The groan of creeping would carry through the silent woods with ominous effect. The stir of the thing's leaves was the first sign of its movement. The entire thing moved, its massive form turning in place. I immediately understood why there had been such odd details on the thing, and the strange sense of pareidolia, I felt while looking at it that I couldn't quite pinpoint. I could see now that several of the large knots and lines throughout had simply been shut, concealing behind them the true nature of whatever was inside of the bark. The lines that had seemed almost carved into the warped wood revealed rows of small, jagged teeth like the jaws of a lamprey. The knots in the bark were apparently eyelids, dozens of them, sprouting forth all over the strange creature. Beneath them sat dozens of little piercing yellow eyes like those of a snake. All of them were directed at me. A cold dagger of dread seared through me. Fuck. The thought summed up all I felt succinctly. My thoughts instantly awash a sort of dread I'd never known, and a familiar irritation at my error, this time with surely dire consequences. It reared back, the hole that could have only have been its mouth stretching open, to give a momentary glimpse at something dark and wet looking beneath it before another mouth opened. This one lined with rows of small teeth that weren't made of wood. A sound like the wail of an infant, but from something much larger, unhinged and raw with emotion, tinged with a fury that made my skin crawl, rang from behind me, echoing off of the surrounding trees, almost making me feel surrounded. The horror rolled through me in tidal waves, adrenaline soon following, sending a warm shock through my system, sending my heart into a painful rhythm. I turned, the hairs on the back of my neck rising as I put the thing behind me, and scurried up the little earth mound and out of the clearing, rising to my feet with more effort than I would have liked. As I started to run back the way I had come, the sound of rushing wind rang out from behind me, like some miniature hurricane moved in my wake, and as I chanced to glance before the hearing disappeared behind the foliage, I saw it stretch itself along the ground and begin slithering forward with all the speed and ferocity of a charging animal. Slithering, with surprising ability between the charred remnants of the forest dotting the impromptu clearing. I ran, jumping over gulches and ducking beneath the limbs of trees as I fled down the unkempt path. The camera and its bag bucked up against my back, slung over opposite shoulders, and I worried for a moment that the strap wouldn't hold before immediately dismissing the thought of how stupid it was given the present circumstances. With every step, my legs threatened to collapse from beneath me, fear and exhaustion spreading like an infection, making my body feel heavy and unresponsive. The rush of blood roared in my ears and my head throbbed as I watched the forest floor ahead of me. Desperate to not stumble over anything, knowing a simple trip, the rush of blood roared in my ears, and my head throbbed as I watched the forest floor ahead of me, desperate not to stumble over anything, knowing a simple trip was the difference between life and a cliché horror movie death. I stuck to the path as best I could, veering off at points in order to put trees between this slithering monstrosity and myself. It cried out again, close enough, behind that I could hear the vibration of it in my bones. My heart plummeted, the sheer horror motivating a very momentary burst of speed. The forest echoed with the cracking of bark and breaking wood from the creature itself and all that it trampled in its wake, the leaves on surrounding trees shaking with its approach. I made the split-second decision to chance another glance behind me. A flood of adrenaline spurred by existential dread spurred me forth as I saw it. That thing! It was slithering amongst the rooftops, making them creak under its weight, as the trunk of its body wrapped around those massive oaks as it stretched from tree to tree. Its branches were merely a grasping of limbs, almost tentacles it seemed, sheathed in wood. It moved with an impossible speed and fluidity for something of its size. The leaves that clung to its limbs ejected their thin vestiges furiously, creating an almost pulse-like effect. It was moving too fast. There was no way I was going to be able to outrun it. The exit from the trail was 10-15 minutes away at least, and the thing was closing the distance between us rapidly, the cacophony behind me growing closer by the second, regardless of my own speed. I'm going to die. This isn't possible. I'm going to die too. I couldn't even finish the thought, not for the horror of the realization but the simple fact that I hadn't any clue what I was running from. Then I heard it. The faint trickle of running water was audible from ahead, even amongst the chaos. I felt a sudden rush of something close to hope. As the charred remnants of the bridge came into view soon after, something in me sparked at the first sight of something familiar, the bridge almost feeling like a landmark to spur me forth. Desperation surged through the passageways of my brain as an idea occurred. Before I could consider what I was doing, I drew the revolver from my waist and lined a shot as best I could while still running. Panic coiled around my heart with every step my pace slowed. As I tried to take in a breath and steady myself, I fired. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please keep an eye out for part 2. I would love to thank the incredible author, YungSeti, for writing the story. Check out the previous story I did of his. My final call as a police dispatcher has scarred me, and I also had the chance to interview him. Links are available in the description. This video was made with the support of my incredible patrons, channel members, top tippers, and subscribers. All support is greatly appreciated. Don't forget to stab the like button, comment, and share the video. Subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my merch, social media links, and my Throne account if you want to get me something extra. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.